Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another random review. Today's random review comes from 1968, and it's Henry Hathaway's 5-card stud, starring Dean Martin and Robert Mitchum. This is a Vinegar Syndrome release, which does seem a little bit odd, as it's a western for Vinegar Syndrome. And it's a fascinating little film for a couple of reasons. You get a nice booklet because it co-stars Yaphet Kotto, a young Yaphet Kotto. This is 1968, and also Roddy McDowall, and also a couple of character actors that you recognise their craggy faces, as well as Inger Stevens, who's always one of those actors you go, who's she again? She's Inger Stevens. Directed by Henry Hathaway, as I said, written by Marguerite Roberts, who was at one point the highest paid female writer in Hollywood, and then she was blacklisted by the House of Un-American Activities for not naming names. And of course the film is about a game of 5-card stud where somebody's found to be cheating and the rest of the players go and lynch him. So witch hunts and lynch mobs is obviously something that Marguerite Roberts can speak to, sadly through her own experience with the Joseph McCarthy and his cronies. But it's amazing to see, two legends of the game, Robert Mitchum and Yaphet Kotto, and Dean Martin's there as well. Technically Dean Martin's the star, but obviously he's just playing Dean Martin. So he is the player who ducks out to go to the bathroom, and when he comes back, Roddy McDowall has got the other guys into a frothy lather, not in the bath but with anger, and they end up lynching the other player who was found cheating from a railway bridge, which is a beautiful scene. Dean Martin turns up, he chases him and turns up, but gets knocked unconscious by Roddy McDowall. And then Robert Mitchum turns up in the town as a preacher, and he introduces himself to the town by walking into the bar and shooting the floor a couple of times to get their attention. Now obviously Robert Mitchum as a preacher will remind us of Night of the Hunter. He's not quite as psychopathic in this film, but then the other players in the game start dying in fairly graphic and nasty ways, generally involving their necks. So it turns from a western into a whodunnit. It turns into an Agatha Christie film, which is a lot of fun, with twists and turns, even though it's fairly predictable how it's going to end, but the journey's quite fun. But what makes the film worth your time is Yaphet Kotto and Roddy McDowall. Roddy McDowall is kind of the spoiled son of another familiar face, and he's a sister. His sister's Catherine Justice, who has a thing for Dean Martin, and Inger Stevens, who runs the local barber shop slash whorehouse, it seems, because the prices are like, and then the last price is specials. But Roddy McDowall's character is basically a psychopath. He's basically waiting for his dad to die so he gets half the ranch with his sister, who he's very protective of, who doesn't want her to be involved with other men. So you can, it's not explicitly talked about, but you can kind of figure it out. But Roddy McDowall, who often plays good characters, in air quotes, he gives a really good turn as a psychopath. He doesn't chew scenery like some people do when they're portraying psychopaths. He does talk about how he hates the world. He has no empathy for other people's feelings. He's basically a psychopath, but he plays it really well. And as I say, there's no kind of over-the-top mannerisms or anything like that. But then we come to Yaphet Kotto. I mean, I didn't even know Yaphet Kotto was in the film. It's actually one of those films that I put a low bid on eBay just for a laugh, and I actually ended up winning it, and I'm glad I did. I mean, you can never have enough Robert Mitchum. But then when I realised Yaphet Kotto was in it, so he plays the barman who was serving drinks at the game, which ended up in a lynching. But he doesn't play, I mean, obviously it's 1968. I was going to say things have improved, but obviously 68 was the year Martin Luther King got assassinated, as well as Robert Kennedy. But as we know, if you watch films from the 30s, 40s and 50s, certainly and the 60s, whenever a African American character comes on screen, you are kind of cringing that they're not going to do the eye rolling yes sir stereotypical kind of black servant or kind of performance that unfortunately does crop up quite a lot in Hollywood films. But I mean, Yaphet Kotto is treated pretty much like an equal, apart from by Roddy McDowall's character. He has as the numbers of the players get lower, obviously suspicion amongst whoever's left is growing, and the finger eventually points to Yaphet Kotto's character, Little George, even though if you know Yaphet Kotto, he's quite a big lad, and he's certainly bigger than everybody in the film, including Robert Mitchum. But he says, if I have to do any killing, I'll do it myself. I won't hire anybody or get anybody else to do my dirty work. I'll do it himself. So it's a kind of refreshing role, because I'm sure Yaphet Kotto wasn't going to take a part that is kind of a stereotypical African American bartender in the West kind of part. So Yaphet Kotto is fantastic in the film, as you'd expect. I mean, Dean Martin is basically Dean Martin. The film, you could argue, needed somebody a lot stronger and better than Dean Martin to be next to Robert Mitchum and Yaphet Kotto, and even Roddy McDowall just wipes the floor with Dean Martin, really. But he's enjoyable enough. But the film does have, because Dean Martin is the lead and he sings the title song, of course, it doesn't particularly have a serious tone, even though people are dying in fairly nasty ways. Because it's Dean Martin, there's a kind of easy ozy kind of atmosphere to the film, whereas perhaps if it was somebody else in the role, it might have had a different atmosphere. But it's wholly enjoyable stuff, with a really good cast, Dean Martin notwithstanding. I know I'm Dean Martin bashing, but it's just they can't really compete with everybody else. Again, Henry Hathaway, who's always kind of one of those guys, does a really good job. It moves briskly along. It's 103 minutes, doesn't feel like it. There's not a lot of wasted time, because you get to know these characters. The female owner of the saloon, slightly older woman, is wonderful as well. There's great dialogue. Again, Marguerite Roberts sadly knows what it's like to be part of a witch hunt. Yeah, as I said, the end might be predictable, but you don't actually mind, because there's some nice twists and turns. And as I said, there's some deaths that would fit in happily in a slasher film. So it is a lot of fun. You could do a lot worse than watching Robert Mitchum and Yaphet Kotto and Roddy McDowall. And Dean Martin's hanging about as well. It looks really good, apart from there's a couple of scenes that almost look as though they were inserted from another print. But apart from that, there's a commentary track by film historian Brian Hannon. There's a nice 21-minute piece by Walter Chaw on the films of Henry Hathaway, even though he talks about Tarantino for a lot of it. I don't know whether Tarantino must have paid him. And then A Woman of True Grit for 14 minutes, which is Lizzie Frank on screenwriter Marguerite Roberts' legacy, which is very interesting. And obviously there's reversible sleeve, and there's a nice little booklet as well. Again, Vinegar Syndrome obviously do some westerns, so it's a bit surprising for it to be a Vinegar Syndrome, but because it is, obviously it's the late 60s, it has a different kind of feel than some of the other westerns. But again, when you consider The Wild Bunch was going to be the year after, which pretty much put paid to westerns like this, which again is kind of light despite the subject matter and some of the gruesome deaths involved. But it's a lot of fun. But again, if Yaphet Kotto and Roddy McDowall weren't doing such interesting jobs, it might not have been as interesting and enjoyable as it is. Despite Robert Mitchum being Robert Mitchum, basically, which is always worth watching. So thanks so much for watching this random review of 5 Card Stud. Please let me know if you've seen it and what you think of it, and hopefully you'll join me again for more random reviews. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.